All right, so this is the first project where we're actually working with a third-party API using fetch to make an HTTP request. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of this before we get into the next video and write our JavaScript. So the API we're working with, and API is just application programming interface. We're working with something called the JSON API. It serves JSON data, which is essentially like a JavaScript object. It looks like this. So curly braces. JSON does use double quotes on the keys and the values, but you can see this is just an object with an ID, a joke, and a status. So if we make an HTTP request, a GET request to this particular URL, we should get something like this. Now, there's a few different formats. The default is going to be HTML, and we don't want that. We want application/JSON. So to get that, we actually have to send a header, because when you send HTTP requests, you can send headers, and we want to send a header of accept equal to application/JSON. And there's many different ways to make requests. We're going to be using fetch within our application. You could even use curl, which is a terminal program. So actually, I'll just show you real quick. Let me open up a new terminal here. And if I paste that in, so basically I'm just using curl to make a GET request to this URL, and I'm adding the header accept application/JSON. And if I do that, you'll see I'll get that object with an ID, a joke, and a status. And each call I make is going to be a different joke because they're random jokes, okay, with a different ID. So another really nice tool to work with APIs is Postman. And you guys don't have to download this or anything. I just want to show you that I can make the same request. So I'm going to make GET request to, I want to get rid of that, to this URL. And if I do that without adding the accept header value, I'm going to get HTML back. Okay, this is HTML. So I want JSON back, so I'm going to add in headers. For a key, I'll say accept. And for a value, it's going to be application/JSON. And if I send that, then I get JSON back. So I just get this simple object, just like you saw when I used curl. And as far as these methods, get just means you're getting data or getting something from the server. Post you typically use when you're submitting data. So if you're submitting like a contact form, or maybe you have an admin screen where you're adding a new blog post or something, that would be a post request. Put is used for updating data that's on the server, same with patch. And then delete is to delete data on the server. And then these down here, you don't really have to worry about. Those are rarely used, at least for this, the stuff that I do. So that's Postman, and you can download it if you want. I think it's getpostman.com if you want to mess around with it. But what we want to do is make that request from our application. And the way we can do that is with using the fetch API. So the fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the HTTP pipeline, such as requests and responses. And there's an example right here. And it doesn't have to be a third-party API like we're using. It could be your own backend. So you could build an API with like Express, Node.js and Express, or Python Django, or PHP Laravel, whatever it might be. Or you can actually get just standard JSON files with fetch. It doesn't have to be some complicated API. Now, when you call fetch to a URL, it returns a promise because it fetches the data asynchronously. So you have this .then when it finishes, and the fetch API is a little weird because you have two .thens. The first one, you get the response, and then you say, well, I want the JSON data. So this is just an arrow function that we pass in, and we're saying response.json. And then we have another .then, because this returns a promise as well, and that gives us the actual data. So in this case, we would be logging the data that's in this movies.json file. So this is a GET request by default. If you wanted to make like a post or put request, you would pass in the URL just as we did above, but then you'd have this extra options value or object, and you'd pass in the method that you want. So in this case, it's a post request. And if you were submitting form data, you would pass that in the body, like If you had a registration form with the name, email, password, that stuff would all go in the body. Okay, and I'm not going to get too deep into this because what we're doing is pretty simple. So we're going to make a GET request to get our joke, put it in our interface or in our, in our application. I'm also going to show you afterwards how we can use a different syntax than this .then. So there's something called async await, which makes it a little cleaner, at least in my opinion, and I think it seems to be, the more popular thing to do when using promises is to use async await rather than .then, because this can get quite messy. So we'll look into that as well. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. We're going to be doing a few projects with, dealing with APIs, dealing with fetch. And there's also a library called Axios, which I actually prefer over fetch. But fetch is built into the browser. You don't have to add a CDN or install it or anything like that. All right, so in the next video, we'll go ahead and make our request to our API using fetch and put it into the application here, get a joke. We'll also have this button make another request to get another joke.